Welcome to the CyberRants podcast, where we're all about sharing the forbidden secrets and slightly embellished truths about corporate cybersecurity programs. We're ranting, we're raving, and we're telling you the stuff that nobody talks about on their fancy website and trade show giveaways, all to protect you from cyber criminals. And now, here's your hosts, Mike Rotondo, Zach Fuller, and Lauro Chavez.
Hello and welcome to the CyberRants podcast. This is your co-host Zach Fuller, joined by Mike Rotondo and Lauro Chavez. Today we are talking about payment card industry data security standards, or PCI DSS compliance, everybody's favorite topic. And we just happen to have two PCI professional certified wizards here on the call, which you can guess which two. They're the bearded ones. So anyway, that being said, let's talk about PCI in a little bit here. But before we do, Mike, why don't you kick us off with the news?
Rogue HackerOne employee steals bugs reports to sell on the side. A HackerOne employee stole vulnerability reports submitted through the bug bounty platform and disclosed them to affected customers to claim financial rewards. The rogue worker had contacted about a half dozen of HackerOne customers and collected bounties in a handful of disclosures, the company said on Friday. HackerOne is a platform for coordinating vulnerability disclosures and intimating monetary rewards for the bug hunter submitting the security report. So be careful. Microsoft finds Raspberry Robin worm in hundreds of Windows networks. Just saying Raspberry Robin worm makes me think of pastry. Microsoft says that recently spotted Windows worm has been found on the networks of hundreds of organizations from various industry sectors. The malware, dubbed Raspberry Robin, spreads via infected USB devices and was first spotted in September 2021 by Red Canary intelligence analysts. Cybersecurity firm Sequoia also observed it using QNAP NAS devices as CNC servers in early November, while Microsoft said it found malicious artifacts linked to the worm created in 2019. Once the USB device is attached, ON's MSI exec process using command.exe to launch a malicious file stored on the infected drive. It infects new Windows devices, communicates with its command and control servers, and executes malicious payloads using several legitimate Windows utilities like FOD Helper, MSI exec, and ODBC conf. New Red Alert ransomware targets Windows, Linux, VMware, ESXi servers. A new ransomware operation called Red Alert, or N13V, I like Red Alert better, encrypts both Windows and Linux, VMware, ESXi servers in attacks on corporate networks. The new operation was discovered by a malware hunter team who tweeted various images of the gang's data leak site. The ransomware has been called Red Alert based on a string used in the ransom note. However, from a Linux encryptor obtained by Bleeping Computer, the threat actors called the operation N13V internally. The Linux encryptor is created to target VMware ESXi servers with command line options that allow the threat actors to shut down any running virtual machines before encrypting the files. So make sure you're patched. Cyber attacks against law enforcement are on the rise. A Los Angeles-based cybersecurity company has registered an increase in malicious activity targeting law enforcement agencies at the beginning of Q2 2022. Threat actors are hacking email and other accounts which belong to law enforcement officers and their internal systems. The emerging trend consists of threat actors sending fake subpoenas and emergency data requests to their victims from hacked law enforcement email accounts. The threat actors are targeting major technology companies to collect sensitive information about targets of interest. The replies received by the bad actors contain sensitive details which are being used to leverage extortion or cyber espionage. Such instances have been especially notable in cybercriminal group activities such as Lapsus and Recursion Group. IT services giant SHI hit by a professional malware attack. SHI International is an international MSP. It has confirmed that a malware attack hit its network over the weekend. SHI provides service to over 1,500 corporate, enterprise, and public sector and academic customer organizations. After the attack, SHI added a message to its website warning customers and visitors that its information systems are undergoing maintenance due to sustained outage. Lastly, Marriott hit by a new data breach and failed extortion attempt. Marriott International was hit by a data breach after an unknown threat actor breached one of its properties and stole 20 gig worth of documents that contained non-sensitive internal business files and some credit card information. This is important. The attackers could only breach one of the chain's properties, BWI Airport Marriott, and only had access to the network for a limited time. The threat actor used social engineering to trick one associate at a single Marriott hotel into providing access to the associate's computer. Train your people on social engineering, please. This is the third data breach Marriott has confirmed since 2018 after exposing the personal information of 5.2 million hotel guests. including contact and personal data in a data breach disclosed in 2020. Couple of key headlines. There's another Google patch for a 0-day. Microsoft has quietly fixed its shadow course Windows NTLM relay bug. Orbit, a new sophisticated Linux malware, is still undetected. There's a Maui ransomware out there. NPM packages that are grabbing data from websites and apps, API issues, and the data of 1 billion Chinese residents available for sale on the dark web. So if you need data on 1 billion Chinese residents, you can find it now.
Already bought my copy.
Yeah, with that, Laurel, what do you got?
I got my copy too. It only cost me like 50 cents. Awesome. So thanks for the news, Mike. I got a couple exploits to talk about today. First is with the Marval Global MSM software. If you're using Marval in any facet inside of your infrastructure to do management or those types of activities, keep a lookout for version 14 because there is a remote code execution for that, and the payload is available for download and use today. So make sure you patch your Marval. And for the other one is kind of an interesting piece. There's this app that's out there. It's called Remote Mouse, or as they call it, Wi-Fi Mouse. And it's essentially an app that you can download on an Android phone. I'm not sure if they have it for your Apple devices, but on Android, you can download this app and you can control your mouse on your computer with it. So it's more of, I call it funware than usefulware. However, if you did decide to download Wi-Fi Mouse, look out for 1.7. There's a remote code execution that will install a file of choice. So the coding is really well done on this, and it even allows the piece for the payload to be put in, so you can call down whatever you'd like to be executed on the phone. So keep an eye out for that. Again, some of the software is, again, it's more funware than it is for practical use, and with all fun stuff comes, well, flaws like this. So that's all I have for exploits. Zach, PCI today, are we?
That's right. That's right. We're going to dive in deep to PCI, but before we do, let's take a quick commercial break, and we will be right back.
Want even more CyberRants? Be sure to subscribe to the CyberRants podcast. Get your copy of our best-selling book, CyberRants, on Amazon today. This podcast is brought to you by Silent Sector, the firm dedicated to building world-class cybersecurity programs for mid-market and emerging companies across the U.S. Silent Sector also provides industry-leading penetration tests and cyber risk assessments. Visit silentsector.com and contact us today.
Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready for some compliance work here? Let's dive in. Let's talk a little bit about payment card industry standards, the PCI compliance. This is something that a lot of organizations have to deal with at some level. And we're going to talk about the various levels. We're going to talk about some of the requirements, how to scope, and all that good stuff that you need to know. But let's start out with just PCI in general. I mean, how would you guys advise people on understanding whether or not they have to abide by PCI at some capacity? Let's say a new organization that's dealing with credit cards. How do they determine, one, do we need this, and two, at what level do we need?
So no, I think it's a good question, Zach. And Mike, please jump in here. But I think the basic, simple response is if you store, process, or transmit credit cards in pretty much any volume, whether it's a point of sale terminal that is taking actual physical cards, or you're doing electronic, what they refer to as card not present transactions. I believe even if you're outsourcing the processing part to a third party processor, you're still responsible for some components of the data security standard.
Yeah. In addition, there are a lot of companies that are credit card companies that are requiring you to fill out PCI whether you store data or not, whether the cards even come into your network. We went through this with one of my customers where they were just literally transacting everything outside the environment, and the payment processor and the bank wanted you to fill out PCI requirements. They had their own online portal that you had to use. So it's a good idea for everybody to be aware if you're taking a credit card of PCI and take whatever necessary steps, because you're going to be asked eventually to at least answer some of the questions, and you need to answer them intelligently and properly. Otherwise, you're going to create additional issues for yourself.
What could happen if you don't
Yeah.
abide by the rules?
If you don't abide by the rules, okay, so there's a lot of there's a lot of myth around what can occur if you're not compliant. So I'll give you two real world stories that Mike and I, well, Mike's been part of both of these. So Mike and I have been working on PCI a lot together over the last decade. So you might remember these, Mike, but we there was one client that had gone out of compliance. Okay, so and here's something to remember too, is that your merchant bank is going to tell you usually if you're required to report to them, because you're going to be processing over 1 million cards. They're going to know about it. You're going to be high on their radar, and they're going to have a PCI consultant inside the bank assigned to you, basically your business. And they're going to communicate with you and tell you that, you need to submit the scans, and, you need to submit at this date, your report on compliance or your self-assessment questionnaire, whichever it is. But if you choose not to go down the PCI path, and so my first story comes from an organization that was processing well over 5 or 6 million transactions a year from each one of the brands. And they looked at the fines that the bank was giving us. The bank gave them 12 months out of courtesy to try to line up, and they failed to get in line. And so then the bank basically started imposing fines of doing business, and the fine was set at $5,500 a month. Okay, this fine, the organization, very large billion-dollar organization, looked at this fine and said, "Oh, well, it's cheaper to pay the fine than it is to try to become compliant. So we'll just pay the fine for a while until we can figure out what to do." You remember this, Mike?
Oh yeah.
So, so this went on for about 24 months, that the organization stalled their PCI compliance initiatives because they warranted it far more inexpensive to pay the fine to the bank and continue to process versus becoming compliant, which was true. I mean, it really was true. I think it ended up costing $13 million for
But
that
very
organization.
short-sighted. Yeah, very
Yeah,
short-sighted.
it was very okay. So that's story one of what can happen if you're that at least I know about. Mike, do you have any other ones that are at least that high of fine?
Not regarding fines. I mean, I have a lot of stories of stupid decisions by management, but other than that,
Well, well, speaking of a stupid decision for management, that's kind of where my second story comes in. Okay, so Mike and I worked with a client that was PCI. They were PCI obligated, right? And so they were going down this path of PCI. Well, one of their large customers executed some business with them, but in the master services agreement, it stated that the service provider would become PCI level 1 compliant within 12 months or pay $1 million per month until compliant. And management signed the master services agreement agreeing to this, not realizing the level of work that was required to become PCI compliant. So let's just say, like, 4 months out of that timer erupting with $1 million a month kind of thing going on, the organization then set in motion this massive path, right, to get all the de-scoped environment compliant. So that's another place where I'd say that be careful of management's bad decisions, because they may put you in a very, very compromised position like this, where now not only are you at risk of $1 million a month, you're going to have to probably spend millions to become compliant quickly enough that you don't suffer that fine.
yeah. And this is real important. Management, look at me, look at me, look at me. Talk to your technical people before you commit to anything, because you don't know what you're talking about for the most part. Your technical people will have an idea of what the scope of what it's going to take and the time it's going to take to be able to become PCI compliant. Random guess of, 12 months sounds fair is not right, because it took them 4 months to define the scope. And then the scope was far too broad. And then they had deprecated systems in that scope. I mean, it was a mess. It was bad. So,
Well, I'm scared. I know I'm going to get PCI compliant. I don't want to pay $1 million a month. Well, hey, let's dive in. So those were obviously some hefty fines, and they can stop your credit card processing altogether. I mean, it can be substantial for companies. Now, let's talk about and obviously those are some fairly sizable organizations with that kind of money moving around, large volumes of credit card processing. What how does an organization go about determining what level it has to align with if somebody's not telling them already, or they want to be proactive and not learn the month before that they have to be at a specific level? How do they define that?
PCI provides you with a handy dandy chart that tells you exactly what you need to do. Typically, it's the payment processor that will define what level you need to do, but we've run across issues with clients that have multiple payment processors due to multiple lines of business, and then you have a confliction between the two levels of compliance. In which case, you need to default to a SAC-D, which is the catch-all. There is if you go to PCI, I think it's DSS.org. Anyway, if
Security
you look at the
Standards
different,
Council. Yeah, it's PCI
that's
Security
it.
Standards Council. They changed it.
Did they?
They did.
All right. So, but there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different levels of PCI compliance that go from all the way from card not present to even still addressing the old, for those of you that remember, the hand machines, the hand imprint machines on up. So even if you just pass everything off to a third-party payment processor, you still have to have some level of compliance either forced on you by the bank or the payment processor, even if you don't store it. Now, if you're storing credit card data, then you need to go through the full deal. Yeah, I mean, so there is a thing that, SAC-A, that's the easiest one to do. Self-attestation, it's a basic one. It's a good place to start, but there are additional, like AEP, which is new, e-commerce merchants who outsource all payment processors to PCI DSS validated third parties and who have a website that doesn't directly receive cardholder data, but that can impact the security of the payment transaction. No electronic storage, processing, or transmission of any cardholder data on the merchant systems or premises is what requirement for an AEP. So if that's you, you need to get that done, and you need to go through the SAC-A or the SAC questionnaire, the self-attestation questionnaire, and do what it says. So
Yeah, the other thing I think, previous to that is it's all based on your transaction volume, right? So, like Mike said, your payment processor or your merchant bank are going to let you know pretty much what you need to do, and so it comes down to how many transactions of what type of credit card you're processing. So, Visa has specific requirements for what they consider to be like a level 1 vendor. So, check the Visa processing requirements site, and then like Discovery, MasterCard, they're going to have different requirements too. So if you're processing, over 1 million or a couple million a year, you're probably going to be in that what they refer to as a level 1 space where you kind of required a third party. And I guess that's the other kind of black magic of PCI is that your transaction volume determines whether or not you can do the self-assessment questionnaires that Mike was referring to, or you've got to actually hire a third party assessor firm to come in and do what they call a report on compliance, or a ROC. And that's got to be a qualified, security assessor, QSA, right? And those are kind of pay to play. So you have to go through PCI training, and then you pay the board money to be on their list of approved QSA firms. And your processing volume will determine. So if you're processing like 10 million credit cards a year, you can't self-assess. You're going to have a third party come in and do this for you. And that's I think a lot of the reason, Mike, why some of these organizations are really trying to push off as much of the payment processing portion of this to third parties that are just doing it, right? That's what their business is.
well, I think there's the financial component, or I think there's also the risk component, right? I mean, and people have
Sure.
come to realize what the risk is of storing credit card data, and the cost of dealing with that risk and mitigating that risk, and the amount of talent you have to have available, and all those things that go down line. So, and Still, there are companies out there running deprecated systems, and you have some internal auditors that we both dealt with that were like, "Oh, well, we'll just take the deprecated systems out of scope." It's like,
Yeah,
no, you can't do that. That's called fraud.
it
Um,
is. It is. It is, and it happens. And I think that that's a good segue to talking about a couple pitfalls that I don't believe everybody's aware of for PCI, right? If you're gonna go through this assessment, there's a couple places that I won't call them a pitfall trap, but they kind of are. And I'll talk about those real quick if that's okay, Zach.
Absolutely. I'm excited. I'm taking notes.
So like Mike was just saying, right? Segmentation is a big deal, right? And so your QSA, it's okay. The QSA, the assessor can sample. Okay, there's a if you pull down and you download PCI DSS 4, like the first 20 pages are just all instructions on how to do it. So make sure you read that part, okay? Because there's no mystery behind this. Okay, the QSAs, your PCI professionals, your internal security assessors that you assign, they're all going through the same document. So all your instructions are laid out for you right in the document. So it's valuable for everybody who even may be involved in this just to download the recent one and read it. Just the first 20 pages. You don't need to get into the requirements portion, but just understand how it's done, right? What the assessor is going to come in and do. But there's a couple areas that PCI Security Standards Council they can't really articulate well, and they can't really decide your architecture for you, right? It's so they have to kind of keep some verbiage in a general area, and I'll talk about that. First one, segmentation. So the QSA has the ability to come and sample your system. So if you've got 150 Windows 10 systems and they're all exact, okay, they have to be exact. And the QSA can validate through deployment guides and hardening standards and other policies and deployment technologies that they are all. Then out of that 100, I don't need to look at all 100 as a QSA. I can take 10 or 20 of them and do a sample set, okay, of evidence collection. And the other thing that allows a QSA to be able to not look at your whole environment is what's referred to as network segmentation, right? And a lot of my network engineers, this has been around for a long time, making virtual local area networks and putting things through access control lists and firewalls and things like that. Have been around a really long time. Okay, the problem is that companies, PCI tells you that you can use segmentation to de-scope specific systems that aren't storing, processing, or transmitting, because those are the three kind of linchpins that you have in PCI. You're storing, processing, or transmitting the data. It's in scope. So are the people, and so are systems that can impact the security of. So those are some other kind of magical terms in the guidelines. But segmentation is something that your architecture is founded upon, right? You either did it or you didn't, or you did it to some capacity, but there's a place in PCI that says that essentially page 12, and I'll just read this, is that segmentation of the cardholder data environment from the remainder of the entity's network is not a PCI DSS requirement. However, it's strongly recommended as a method that may reduce the scope of the assessment, cost of the assessment, cost and difficulty of implementing and maintaining control states, and risk to the organization's relative payment card account data. Okay, so they're not telling you got to do it, but if you don't do it, then the whole of your network is in scope. Okay, so if you didn't implement segmentation properly, the auditor can come in and tell you that your whole infrastructure is in scope, not just the systems that you have storing, processing, and transmitting. While PCI DSS gives us a segmentation language, it doesn't define what segmentation is for you in your architecture. And this is where the magic trap happens, is that you can have an assessor that comes in and bullies you because you didn't set up network segmentation properly, or you don't have it defined, right? Which a lot of organizations do not have what network segmentation is as a definition in a policy or standard for their organization. So step one, build a document about what network segmentation is in your environment, okay, and how you delineate between a flat network that's all connected together and everything can communicate versus a segmented network, and what components that you use in your business to provide the segmentation controls. Okay, so that's goal one. That way, if an assessor tries to argue with you, you can hold up the standard And then you can validate that the segmentation is in place, right? Which is something that the QSA is asked to do, is validate segmentation's in place and working. Okay, and that's done with
Many
network packets.
many assessors think they're this guy.
Yeah. Exactly. They are not Batman. They are, I won't say it, but yeah, so
Papa
a
Smurf.
lot of Papa Smurf, a lot of the assessors, Mike's got a big point. Okay, a lot of these assessors are interns and college grads that are going into these large firms, and they're getting a very set curriculum, and then they're getting sent out to do this stuff. Okay, they're not engineers, they're not extremely technical individuals. So there's a lot of room for misunderstanding of technical controls. Okay, so it's your job, owning this audit, right? Not to be intimidated by the assessor, but to help the assessor understand what controls are in place in your environment and how you meet these controls. So define your segmentation with a standard, right? A segmentation standard. And then the other place I'll talk about pitfall traps is what's called significant changes. Okay, what the DSS is going to refer to significant changes. And they, in PCI 4, they've actually tried to define what significant changes. And on 26, I'll just tell you verbatim here. So um, there are certain requirements which performance is specified upon significant change in the entity's environment. Okay, so some of these activities are new hardware, software, networking, equipment to the cardholder data environment, any replacement or major upgrades of hardware or software, any changes to the flow of storage of account data, any changes to the boundary of the cardholder data environment and or to the scope of the assessment, any changes to underlying supporting infrastructure of the cardholder data environment, including but not limited to changes to directory services, time servers, logging and monitoring, any changes to third-party vendors, service providers that support the cardholder data environment or requirements on behalf of your entity. That's a lot of, okay, what you need to do again is define what a significant change is in your architecture. PCI is giving examples. This section is called descriptions and examples. Okay, this doesn't mean this is the definitive definition of what significant changes in your architecture, but if you don't define it, an assessor is going to come in and try to argue with you over what and what is not considered a significant change. So document that as well, right? Define what significant changes are in your environment and what things are going to be required as controls. And so PCI further goes on to talk about, penetration testing after significant changes, right? So they're going to tell you in 6.4 that, public facing web applications need vulnerability scanning and penetration tests at least every 12 months or after significant changes. So if the assessor comes in and says, well, you made 6 significant changes in this quarter and you didn't do any pen test, fail, you have to have some form of ammunition, of technical ammunition to come back and say, no, that's not correct. These changes that were made were enhancements, in fact, and didn't change the core of the code that is tested after significant changes, which happens in our agile schedule every 8 months, as an example, or whatever, right? Every fifth push is a prod that gets a pen test before. So keep that in mind. And then if you're, if you're a third party service provider, you're going to be required to do things more frequent, and then significant changes again are become more complex to define for you. So if you're providing services for companies that are trying to be PCI compliant and they're outsourcing their services to you, and you're that provider, you come into that provider crosshair, you're required to do things more frequently. So it's even more important that you define what a significant change is in your complex environment where you may have VPCs dedicated to certain clients, and you're making changes, you're doing updates, you're doing vulnerability scanning and patching. You've got to define what those significant changes are, or an assessor will come in and try to define that for you, and you could lose your compliance status if you don't write this stuff down.
Yeah, so the key component of that is you can define your own risk. You have to do your internal risk management, and you can define your processes, define what these things are. And that's one of the common failings of a lot of companies is they allow the assessor to define these things. You can't do that. And you have to push back on the assessor's assessment of what your risk truly is. The other thing is that a business justification will trump just about anything that PCI is requiring. If you can justify from the business perspective that we have to do it this way because, then there's really not much they can say. So define your risk, define what's in there, define your processes, define those things prior to the auditor. and that will minimize the pain of the audit and what you have to do. But defining your scope is critical, because you have, and this goes back to dealing with management. They'll say, oh yeah, we'll make the whole company PCI compliant. Well, if you've got a company that has 5 different regions, some of them international, managed by different managers, and they have different levels of software and server types, and you're running Linux over here and you're running Windows over here and this, that, and the other thing, making the entire environment compliant is very, very difficult, especially if you don't have dedicated staff for it. Doing it during your KTLO isn't going to do it. So you really need to get ahead of the audit and get, have an idea what you're going to do before. You need to bring in someone who knows a PCIP from some firm that's not your auditor to go through and look internally, or send one of your people to training, get them PCIs trained, and let them help you determine what's going on here and make this as painless as possible.
Yeah, that's a good point, Mike. And I want to talk training real quick. I know I've had a mouthful this episode, so I apologize to everybody out there. But training is super important, okay? Because what's going to happen is as you start, if you've got one individual in charge of internal PCI compliance, your other department managers, your other siloed managers may start arguing about things, right? About this or that, or not understanding, or why do we have to do this? I always recommend, and when I ran PCI programs with Mike, we always made sure that everybody went to training. I'd pick a random manager and an individual from a completely different group, and we would send them to PCIP school, or we'd have the Security Standards Council come to the organization and give us the class there in like a big break room or something, But you want to get your people trained because, you need them on your side to help you win this fight. And if you've got the standard red tape and interdepartmental politics and bureaucracy that happen in a lot of big corporations, odds are you've got contention between other environments trying to get things done with the network manager or with the apps manager or whatever the case may be. Send those people to school. That way they're on your team. They're all wearing the same jersey. They all understand where the line's drawn, and then they become part of your assessment team versus being like this kind of, this fight internally just to get the control states in place so that you can be compliant.
Well, outstanding. We're running out of time here, but this was excellent, some excellent wisdom into the world of PCI. So if you're dealing with that right now or gearing up to get ready for it, I hope you learned something here. And shameless plug, there's a lot more where that came from in the book, CyberRants, available on Amazon. So we have some white papers and things through Silent Sector as well on it. So feel free to reach out. Let us know what you'd like us to talk about on next episode's struggles, anything around assessments, testing, compliance, governance, all the fun stuff that we do. We love chatting about it. And I think PCI, Mike and Laura, I think this is your favorite compliance requirement.
No, nothing beats my first love, SOC 2.
SOC 2, right? But so second only to SOC 2. But thanks again for listening. Please rate the podcast, share the podcast, and help us get the information out there. And we will see you on the next episode.
Pick up your copy of the CyberRants book on Amazon today. And if you're looking to take your cybersecurity program to the next level, visit us online at www.silentsector.com. Join us next time for another edition of the CyberRants podcast.